Hi, and welcome to our first installment in the Spotlight on Copyright. My name is Jalen Johnson, and I'm an attorney advisor here with the Public Information and Education Office. And I have joining me today Professor Lateef Mtima, who's a professor of law at Howard University School of Law, where he focuses on intellectual property and other areas of law. He's also the founder and director of an independent non-governmental organization, the Institute for Intellectual Property and Social Justice, where the work there is focused on dedicating time and resources and energy and attention to social justice issues and the intersection with intellectual property laws. Thank you for joining me, Professor Mtima.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here.
So, Lateef, you were with us at the Copyright Office's event that focused on social justice and the intersection of social justice and intellectual property. And there you spoke about the importance of copyright being broadly inclusive and providing an opportunity for everyone to contribute. So, given the pandemic and its disproportionate impact on Black and Brown people and people of color, and the subsequent nationwide protest against police brutality, how do you see that these crises have impacted creators and creative communities of color?
Well, of course, from the outset, creators of color are, of course, just people like everybody else. And so in the immediate sense, they are affected the same way that everybody else is affected. The same way that in their communities, they are disproportionately impacted by the impacts of the pandemic, the economic and the social effects. As people of color, they feel the same effects in the same way. But then, of course, as creatives, as is always the case for creatives, the impact goes a step further, because what creative people do, what creative expression is really all about, is to initially look within yourself to try to understand who you are, and then who you are within the context of the environment and the world that you are living in, and then to sort of address what's happening around you. And when things that are happening around you are particularly momentous and unjust, you feel this need to give voice to it, right? And initially, you want to give voice to it in terms of what it means to you. But as is the case for most creative, most artistic people, they then begin to draw upon the people and situations around them. And before long, they realize that they're not only giving voice to how they feel about it and their concerns and their fears and their questions, but they find that they are becoming the muse for the people around them, for the communities that they are a part of. And that oftentimes, when those that are around them can't quite find the words, because initially they can't quite even put their finger on what is wrong, right? Why this is particularly unjust, right? What is happening to them, right? And then as they begin to grapple with that, right, it is so liberating to find that as they struggle to find the words to comprehend what's happening and to express how they feel about what's happening, that they find that there's a person, a creative artist who has been able to capture that for them. And what that creative artist is doing when he or she is expressing, right? He or she ultimately ends up expressing not only her feelings about it, but the feelings of the community of which he or she is a part. And then, of course, they're able to convey that to the larger society who is outside of this, right? And so it ends up providing a fantastic bridge of common understanding, right? And I think we've seen that in a very potent way in terms of the Black Lives Movement protests that began this spring. And look at what it led to. I mean, it led to the first significant nationwide conversation about race and inequality really since the 1960s and 70s. So I think the impact on them, and in turn, the impact that creators have had on these social issues and these social movements has been quite concrete and quite powerful.
You mentioned that this sort of being one of the first times that we've had this nationwide conversation since like the 60s and 70s. So can you talk a little bit more about that and maybe speak to sort of how socio-political movements throughout history have inspired creative works?
Well, one of the things about both social and political and economic injustice and the movements, the social political movements that arise to address those conditions and to draw attention to those conditions, oftentimes there is a missing piece in between. It is the distinction between there being an unjust situation and then some expert theoretical policy assessment of that attempts to identify it, to calibrate it, to quantify it, and to help people to understand it.
Yeah.
And just the way that I articulated that points to a problem. And that is that it doesn't do very much for everyday people, right? Everyday people just sort of go, okay, and what is it that you're trying to say? What is it that you're trying to capture? And that's where the politically aware creative comes in. That's where that person makes the connection. That person is able to grasp what it is that people are grappling with, what it is that they need to say and to share about it, and to put it in a package, to put it in a voice that not only captures what those who want to speak want to say, but conveys those feelings, okay, to that audience and to the audience beyond. So I've always, wondered that, well, if we didn't have the work of a Charles Hamilton Houston creating the litigation strategy to achieve civil rights and legal equality for African Americans, the impact of those movements, what impact did that have to awaken certain things in creators of those times? What impact did that have, for example, on a Richard Wright who would go on to write Invisible Man? What impact did those movements and the conversations that arose as a result of those movements, what did it have on a James Baldwin, right? And then in turn, what impact did Ralph Ellison and James Baldwin have not only on the communities that they were a part of, who could say, yes, that's what I have been trying to say, and somebody understands and somebody is amplifying. And then what impact did those works also have on the people outside of those communities, right? Who up until then didn't really quite understand what was happening to people of color, right? They just sort of knew in some peripheral way, yeah, there are Negroes, which is of course what we're calling it in that time, and they have an existence that's on the margins of society. And I kind of have a general feeling that they're not especially happy, but beyond that, and so even when these things boil over into political unrest, you have that expected response, right? For any movement. Could be women's suffrage. It could be gay liberation rights in the 70s, right? You have mainstream people seeing the unrest, hearing the anger, but largely saying, but I don't really know what's the problem, right? Why are they so upset? I can't quite get, but then it's those creative voices, right? Anybody can sit down and read Invisible Man and begin to understand. Anybody can sit down and begin to read James Baldwin and begin to understand. And so I think those movements impact the creatives. And then in turn, the creatives impact those movements by broadening the reach and making that all important connection to people and giving it that absolutely essential grassroots momentum.
You're sort of explaining how the social and political movements have informed creatives, and creatives in turn have gone on to create and inspire works that inform people, that give them more access to information, that give them a voice to sort of say things that they didn't otherwise have the words to say, or know things that they might not have otherwise known. Can you think of any other ways that expressive endeavors, perhaps, outside of informing people and giving people a voice, how it sort of inspired them to actually act and take action in response to these types of movements?
Well, it's not only the case that political activists inspire creatives, but something that many, oftentimes, even in movements like the civil rights movement, don't fully appreciate is the way in which political activists and community organizers, the way in which they utilize creative expression themselves. Oftentimes, I hear leaders in the movements and people active in the movements, when you try to raise issues of copyright and other areas of intellectual property and the interests of our community in those areas, sometimes the response is, well, I kind of see what you mean, but that's not directly relevant to what we do. We're about bringing about social change. And one of the things I have to clarify for them is to say, oh, but that's at the heart of what you do, right? Because I could stand up and I could try to explain to people, mainstream society, for example, why racial discrimination and inequity is unfair and unjust, and why it devalues not only those who are the subject of it, but those who are the perpetrators of it. I could give lecture after lecture and dissertation after dissertation on that, and it would be nowhere near as effective as Dr. Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream, right? Oftentimes, the way that the message takes root and has impact owes itself to the way in which the speaker has chosen to creatively express it. And creative expression is, I would say, at the absolute core of the effectiveness of social political movements. It's not that you're saying something that people are unaware of, right? But you're expressing it in such a way that it galvanizes people, it moves people, it touches people, it reaches people. So I think creative expression is at the heart, particularly of the kinds of movements that we've been discussing.
That's really important and really sort of eye-opening to me as a person who works in the space with copyright and creative expression. And I hear what you're saying about it being so important to the heart of those movements and to galvanizing and bringing to action and informing and educating. So to those creatives, what would you say to them about the importance of copyright to that?
Well, of course, the baseline, observation is that a copyright is the mechanism, the tool whereby you will retain control over your work. It can also be the mechanism whereby, if you are interested in this, to obtain some sort of commercial reward from your work. Although in this particular context, if you are having the conversation, strictly within the context of, I want to get my message out because I want to empower people. I'm not thinking about commercial rewards. So why is copyright important to that goal?
Mm-hmm.
And what I would say to them is that, well, if you seek to empower others, one of the first things you have to do is empower yourself. Make certain that you are in the best possible position to assist others before you engage in that endeavor. And copyright is the way in which you can retain control over your creative contributions to the world and to that movement, right? It is the way in which you can be certain that, in effect, you can be assured that your powers are used for good and only for good. This is how you make certain, and we see it today, for example, how often do we see these days conflicts between creative artists in the music world and political candidates? People who are using their musical works in connection with messages that those creators would not be interested in endorsing, right? So copyright is a way to further those goals, but also it is a way to give you a greater sense of self-empowerment, right? Even if you never actually exercise it, even if you never end up in a conversation or a conflict with someone who wants to do something with your work or a piece of your work that you don't approve of, even if that never happens, for people in marginalized groups and marginalized communities to know that there is something that you created and that now that you have let it out into the world, there is a means by which you can continue to control it. It gives you a sense of empowerment, right, that you would not otherwise necessarily have, right? So even if it does nothing other than that, I think for creatives to understand that that option is available to them, that's a very, very, very important recognition for them to make just as a threshold matter.
I hear what you're saying, Professor Mtima, and traditionally, every time I've tried to use copyright and I've gone after or trying to use copyrighted works and I've encountered these things, it's been a hindrance to me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's been something that I've been told I can't do.
Yeah.
And something that I've been told stops me from creating in the way that I would like to create. Mm-hmm. So to that person, what do you say to them?
That, of course, is an enduring impediment. And I think the best way to sort of begin that conversation is to point out to people that, once upon a time, Black people in America, they did not go to court to seek justice because they knew they could not find justice there. But today, we understand that the courts can be a place where you can find justice, that is the purpose and intention as to why the courts are there, notwithstanding the fact that they aren't always utilized that way. So one of the things that we have to dispel is that, well, just because copyright has oftentimes been used to exploit our creative endeavor does not mean that that is its only function. Mm. And it certainly doesn't mean that that is its intended function. Mm. Oftentimes, what we have still not yet distinguished is between discriminatory copyright business practices, okay, which is not the same thing as saying discriminatory copyright legal provisions. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say that there are not aspects of the copyright statute that impact non-Western creativity, non-mainstream creativity in less than favorable ways, right? That can happen. But as a whole, the copyright system is available to marginalized creators and can be utilized every bit as effectively to support their interests, right, as it has been used against them. The real issue has been those using copyright against our communities were familiar with copyright. And those who oftentimes were on the wrong end of the stick, the principal reason as to why copyright was able to be utilized against them in a negative way was simply because they were unfamiliar with it. They didn't understand it as a tool. And once we became and become familiar with it, and we begin to see ways in which we can use it to our advantage, we're already ahead of the game, right? I mean, one of the best examples of that is, of course, the legendary revelation about Ray Charles and him acquiring his master recordings. And for those who aren't familiar with the term and with the music industry, basically the master recording is that initial recording that you go into the studio and you make. And that's where the copyright, of course, exists. And all the others that are made after that, those are just copies, but all the legal rights exist in who owns that initial copy that was made in the recording studio. If Ray Charles had not learned about copyright, if he had continued to be afraid of copyright, if he continued to think that copyright can only be used to steal stuff from me, he would never have known that all he has to do is wait for that moment when he has some leverage. Wait for that moment when he's no longer under contract, but he's still a big star. And the recording company is coming to him and saying, well, we want you to sign another contract. And now he knows that there is something of value that they have that he wants to ask for. And of course, he can also take advantage of, for once, their ignorance, right? Right? Because now both parties are aware of the power of copyright, right? They have the copyright on the master recordings. He's now asking, okay, well, I'll sign, but I want you to transfer those to me. But what does he now know that they don't know? They're thinking, yeah, this newfangled thing called the rock and roll rhythm and blues, it's not going to last. So if he wants the legal rights to some former hit records that aren't even on the charts anymore, if that's what we have to give in order to get the juicy stuff, meaning the new stuff that he's about to produce, fine, take them. But it was his knowledge of copyright that put him in this incredible position that we now know to be, you know what, Ray? I think we know you got the better part of that deal.
That was a really great explanation of sort of the importance about knowledge in terms of not only how it informs how we think about different social and political issues, but also how creators and creatives and people who use creative works can think about being involved with copyright and what that means for them. So before we end, I just want to give you an opportunity to share any final thoughts or anything that you would really like for our community to know in regards to copyright or social justice or the intersection, anything that you would like to share.
First of all, I really appreciate this opportunity to have this conversation because certainly it is a very important conversation for creatives and audiences of marginalized communities so that they can have a better understanding as to what copyright can do for them, right? To further their interests, to support their work, and to help amplify their voices. But, the other important component of this perspective towards copyright is that as much as it does a great deal for marginalized communities, people of color, et cetera, it also does a great deal for mainstream society. Because one of the things that until recent decades, we sort of, in terms of prevailing law and policy thinking about copyright and other IP, is that we kind of lost sight as to what is the overarching role of copyright in our society. It is to promote creative, expressive endeavor towards society's overall benefit. On the surface of that, we can immediately see that, well, the more expressive work that we have, the better our society is going to be, because expressive work is so essential to learning and to knowledge. But then as we begin to think about it, it quickly occurs to us that it's not just about having more creative works, it's also about having diverse creative works. There are lots of different messages, lots of different subjects, lots of different thoughts, feelings, and emotions, ways in which to think about our world, our society, our culture, who we are, right? And the more participants and the more diverse the group of participants, the richer the ultimate product, the richer the overall contributions to our national storehouse of culture is ultimately going to be. One of my favorite metaphors in this context is to say that, if we were all on an ocean liner and captain realizes that dead ahead there's a whirlpool or an iceberg, and we've got like about 6 hours before we hit and we go down. We need ideas. You can bet the captain is not going to say, okay, great, round up everybody in first class and give me their ideas, but forget about any ideas that come from steerage.
Yeah.
We know in that moment that we need every idea. We need the best of what everyone can contribute. And at the end of the day, from that enormous pool, if there's any chance for us to move forward, any chance for us to be saved, we're going to find it in that mix. And so that's why the social justice perspective of copyright, it not only empowers the communities who have been underserved and undervalued, but it empowers the nation as a whole. And so I think this is a conversation that anyone and everyone who's interested in copyright, interested in expressive and artistic endeavor, it's a conversation that anyone can benefit from. And so we all owe a debt to you and the rest of the Copyright Office for having the forethought to recognize that a conversation like this not only needs to be done, but also needs to be recorded and shared so that everyone can benefit from it.
I just want to thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge and your expertise. Thank you for giving us lots to think about in regards to how copyright and social justice issues come into play, and really informing and expanding our knowledge. So I really appreciate you for being here with us and for sharing that with us.
Great. Thanks very much. It's been an enormous pleasure.